Okay, so picture this. A super modern, high-tech city, a global hub for pretty much everything, but it's facing one of the oldest problems in human history. How does it feed its people? We're talking about Singapore, and this is the story of their incredibly ambitious plan to secure their food future, a mission they call 30 by 30. And this number right here is everything. A whopping 90% of all the food in Singapore is imported. It comes in from over 180 different countries. And look, for decades, that system worked just fine. It was like the whole world was their grocery store. But what happens when the shelves in that global grocery store suddenly go empty? Well, that's not a what-if question anymore, is it? We've all seen it, the pandemic, a war kicking off somewhere, sudden export bans from neighboring countries. These things have turned that worst-case scenario into a real, pressing danger for Singapore. So how in the world did this island nation end up so completely dependent on everyone else for its food? Let's take a look at how this all happened, and why it's now become a major national security issue.
As Singapore was racing to build itself up, to industrialize and urbanize, something had to go. And that something was farmland. I mean, look at this timeline. Back in the 60s, a quarter of the entire island was used for agriculture. Fast forward to 2021, and it's shrunk to less than 1%. Farms just got paved over for factories and homes. It made a ton of economic sense back then, but boy did it create a huge vulnerability down the line.
And this was the massive wake-up call. The Global Food Security Index had Singapore at number 1. But then they plummeted. See, the index started looking at things like supply chain resilience a lot more closely, and it suddenly exposed Singapore's biggest weakness. The very thing that made them successful, relying on a stable, globalized world, was now a huge risk. So, what did they do? The government didn't just make a small change. Nope. They launched what you could basically call a national moonshot. This incredibly ambitious project known as the 30 by 30 mission. So here's the core goal. Produce almost a third of the country's food right there, at home. But here's the real kicker. They have to do it on that same tiny sliver of land, less than 1%. This isn't about going back to old school farming. This is all about taking a giant leap forward with technology. And you gotta pay attention to the language the government is using here. They're not just saying they need an increase. They're calling for new paradigms. This isn't just a memo to farmers, it's basically a call to arms for scientists, engineers, and innovators to completely reinvent the very idea of a farm. This chart really just shows you the massive mountain they have to climb. I mean, they're doing okay with local eggs, but the real challenge? It's in seafood and vegetables. They're only producing 7% of their own seafood and a tiny 3% of their own veggies. Getting from there to the 30% target in just a handful of years, that is a monumental task. So how on earth do you pull that off with basically no land? Well, the strategy isn't to build out, it's to build up. Let's get into the actual plan. Right, so this isn't just one simple fix. It's a whole strategy. It starts with a ton of funding and building high-tech infrastructure. We're talking climate-controlled vertical farms, AI-powered fish farms. Then you've got to train a whole new generation of agro-tech workers. And finally, you have to bet big on pure research and development for the kinds of foods we might all be eating in the future. And when I say they're putting money into this, I mean they are really putting money into this. Hundreds of millions of dollars in grants and funds. It's all designed to help farms scale up, to encourage innovation, and to fast-track research into everything you can imagine, from new crops that can handle climate change to robots for vertical farms. This was huge. It made headlines all over the world. By giving the green light to cultivated meat, Singapore was basically sending a message. We are serious, and we will explore every single option, even the stuff that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction, to hit our food security goals. But then you get the reality check. The initial hype was off the charts. Companies were promising these huge factories churning out tons of meat. The thing is, going from a cool idea in a lab to something you can actually buy for dinner is incredibly hard and super expensive. And some of the big names in the field have already hit some serious roadblocks, which tells us this food revolution might be a little further away than we hoped. And that brings us to the biggest obstacles. Because beyond all the cool tech challenges, Singapore's new generation of farmers are running into some very old-school economic problems. This right here, this quote gets to the absolute heart of it. You can grow the most amazing high-tech food in the world, but if nobody actually buys it, the whole system just falls apart. The government's basically saying, hey, this is a team effort. Food security is a joint responsibility, and shoppers have a really important part to play. And here is why getting people to buy local is so tough. The high-tech, locally grown stuff is often more expensive. So when you're at the grocery store and you see two options side by side, that price difference, even if it's just $1 or $2, can be the thing that makes the decision for you, no matter how much you want to support local farms. I mean, this chart just puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? That core problem for Singapore. With less than 1% of its land for farming, it's working with a tiny fraction of what its neighbors have. It's even just a quarter of what another dense city like Hong Kong has. And that scarcity just drives up the cost of absolutely everything. So all of this comes together to create a kind of perfect storm of challenges. You've got high costs for land and electricity, which leads to higher prices for the food. Those higher prices mean fewer people buy it. And on top of all that, there's a shortage of people who want to work in the sector, and land is always being taken for other uses. It's a really tough cycle for these farms to break.
So, with all these massive challenges, you have to ask, is this 30x3 mission just a pipe dream? Or is it something that Singapore simply cannot afford to fail at?
Well, the way forward seems to be tackling these problems from all sides. Experts are suggesting things like having small farms team up in cooperatives to buy supplies in bulk and lower their costs. They also recommend more government help with things like transport and logistics, plus big campaigns to make farming seem like a cool, high-tech career for young people. And this quote just nails it. Really, it sums the whole thing up. The cost of doing nothing is just too high. In a world that seems to get more and more unstable, having that buffer of locally grown food isn't a nice to have, it's an absolute necessity for survival. The goal is incredibly difficult, sure, but that doesn't change the fact that they have to try.
And that kind of leaves us with this one big question, right? Singapore is a test case here. They are throwing immense resources, technology, and political will at a problem that a lot of other cities around the world are going to face sooner or later. So is this high-tech, high-cost, high-stakes experiment the blueprint for how we're all going to feed ourselves in the future? That's a question we should all be watching very, very closely.